In the land of Uz, once peaceful and prosperous, there lived a man whose name echoes through the centuries with the strength of perseverance and faith. Job, a name that would come to symbolize human trial and unshakable trust in the divine. The Holy Scripture describes him with words of profound reverence and exaltation. Blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Imagine for a moment his life, blessed with immense wealth, perhaps beyond our modern comprehension, with thousands of sheep and camels, oxen and donkeys, and a multitude of servants. A prosperity that was not only material, but also a visible sign of God's favor upon his righteous life. His family, life was equally full, surrounded by the love of his sons and daughters, offspring who were his joy and pride, and his health, robust, a vitality that seemed unshakable. The biblical description paints a picture of an existence that seemed, in human eyes, perfect, a fortress of righteousness and blessings, untouched by the common afflictions of life. But this apparent perfection, this wall of prosperity and piety, was about to be subjected to an unimaginable test. A scene unfolds in the celestial realms, in the corridors of eternity, where Satan, the cunning accuser of souls, presents himself before the unquestionable majesty of God. He observes the life of Job, this righteous and blessed man, and utters an audacious accusation full of malice. He suggests, with the subtlety of a serpent, that Job's faithfulness is not genuine, that his devotion is conditional. He argues that Job serves God only because he has been surrounded by blessings and protection, that his devotion is motivated by the security and prosperity he receives, and not by true love and unconditional faith. "Stretch out your hand now," Satan challenges, with cutting cynicism, "and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." God's response to this challenge is sovereign and astounding. In his infinite wisdom and inscrutable purposes, he allows Job's faith to be tested in a terrible and overwhelming way. "Behold, all that he has is in your power," declares the Most High to the adversary, handing Job's possessions over to the mercy of destruction. But he imposes a clear condition, a non-negotiable limit on Satan's fury and destructive power. A barrier that he could not, under any circumstance, would cross. "Only against him do not stretch out your hand." His life. That was the only line Satan could not cross in this test permitted by God. The stage was set for a trial that would strip Job of everything he possessed and loved, exposing to the universe the depth of his devotion and the true nature of his relationship with the Creator, not based on possessions or comfort, but on a pure and resilient faith. And thus, after the challenge issued in the heavenly realms, a shadow fell upon the life of Job, the upright and God-fearing man. Divine permission had been granted, but with a clear limit. His life would be spared, but the attack would be directed against all else he possessed and loved. No sooner had the decree been established, an avalanche of calamities was unleashed, almost simultaneously, like accurate and merciless blows struck one after another, without respite or warning. Reports of losses arrived like gales of destruction. Our ears could barely process the speed and magnitude of the disaster. Entire flocks decimated, servants killed by the sword, wealth accumulated over a lifetime of work and blessings, all swept away in the blink of an eye. Job's material prosperity, so vast that it set him apart among the people of the East, crumbled into ruins, like a fortress imploded by an invisible and overwhelming force. The land of Uz, which had witnessed his opulence and generosity, now saw his desolation. But the most devastating blow, that wounded the soul in its deepest essence, was the loss of his family, those whom he loved more than himself. His sons and daughters, gathered in the eldest son's house for a fraternal banquet, were struck by a mighty wind that caused the structure to collapse, burying everyone under the rubble. The pillar of his affection and earthly hope was torn away brutally and irreversibly. No human consolation seemed possible in the face of such a loss. In the face of such calamity, what reaction would be expected from a mortal? Absolute despair, bitter revolt, curses against fate or against existence itself. But what we witnessed in Job was something that transcended common understanding. Yes, he tore his garments, a universal sign of mourning and deep sorrow. Yes, he mourned, for the loss was real, and the human suffering was genuine in his heart. Yet, amidst the mourning and desolation, he bowed down and worshipped. He worshipped the one who had allowed all this to happen. His words echoed with a strength and faith that defied the very logic of tragedy. "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return," he said with a resignation that was not weakness, but recognition of divine sovereignty. "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." What a powerful declaration of trust and acceptance of God's will, even when that will seem to bring only pain and deprivation. His faith remained unshaken in this terrible situation, becoming a beacon of trust and faith in God for all generations to come. He lost everything, but he did not lose his devotion to the Most High. Job's suffering did not find its end in the initial trials. A new and terrible affliction descended upon his mortal flesh. He was tormented by a painful illness, a plague that left him covered in sores from head to foot, in constant and excruciating agony, a relentless pain that gnawed at his peace and consumed his strength with each passing moment. Imagine the skin broken, raw, without a single unharmed spot on his entire body, an incessant torture that transformed the simple act of existing into an almost unbearable burden. It was not just the loss of possessions or family, but the very temple of his soul, his body, was under brutal attack. Every breath, every movement reverberated with the pungent pain of the open sores. It was the visible personification of his torment. And so we find him, not in his home, not among his own. Job sat in ashes, a place of deep mourning and humiliation, seated in the dust and desolation, a poignant portrait of human misery. And there, under the weight of physical pain and overwhelming loss, he sought some primitive relief. Scraping his open sores, not gently, but with the harshness of pottery shards, an image of total despair, the rough pottery against the wounded skin, a desperate act to mitigate the insane itching, even if it caused more pain. It was the rawness of suffering exposed, the fragility of man before relentless illness. In this deep solitude of pain and ashes, they came seeking him, his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, 3 men who set out to come and console him. They came from a distance, moved perhaps by the news of his calamity, or perhaps by the genuine affection they held for him in the days of his prosperity. They arrived and saw the scene. They saw Job, their respected friend, transformed by illness and mourning, seated in the desolation of the ashes, covered in sores. The sight must have been shocking, perhaps almost unrecognizable. And before such a scene of suffering, words failed them. They sat down, they simply sat with him. There in the ashes, under the sky that bore witness to Job's pain, his friends sat in silence. 7 days and 7 nights, the scriptures say, without a single one of them uttering a word. A heavy silence, laden with perplexity and shared grief. There were no counsels, no accusations, just the silent presence, sharing the unbearable weight of that unparalleled suffering. It was a silence of respect, or perhaps of pure shock and inability to comprehend the depth of the calamity that had befallen such a righteous man. They shared the pain not with words, but with their somber, silent company. A stillness that spoke volumes about the magnitude of Job's tragedy. What a solemn moment of mutual grief. Behold, the quietness that hung over Job's ashes began to dissipate. Those who had come to share in his mourning, sitting in silence for long days, now raised their voices, no longer as compassionate comforters, but as inquisitors driven by a distorted understanding of suffering. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, once friends in sorrow, became advocates of an inflexible theology. Their conviction was clear and relentless. Job's overwhelming suffering could only be the result of hidden sins, of unconfessed transgressions that had drawn divine wrath upon him and his house. The message echoed darkly, "Job, you must have sinned. You must repent for this calamity to cease." This was the lens through which they saw the hand of God in the life of their suffering friend, a cold and accusatory view. Upon Job, already prostrated by loathsome disease and unspeakable losses, now fell the weight of his companion's words. Friends who should have offered relief, offered veiled or direct accusations. They could not conceive of such immense suffering, falling upon a truly righteous man. Their human logic dictated that God's punishment always followed sin, and so they pressured Job to confess, to acknowledge a guilt that he knew he did not possess regarding the cause of his torment. The stage was set for a deep and agonizing debate. Job, torn by physical pain and now by his friends' incomprehension and judgment, found strength to respond. His speeches erupted from a soul in agony, amidst overwhelming perplexity. How could this be? He knew his integrity, his devotion to God, and yet he was plunged into unprecedented suffering. His lamentations were a cry for justice, a yearning to understand the purpose behind his pain. He expressed the anguish of his soul, the feeling of abandonment, the desire to present his case before God, not to deny divine sovereignty, but to understand why. Despite the searing pain, despite the overwhelming pressure from his friends to confess sins that were not the root of his suffering, Job clung to a faint, yet firm, hope, an inner conviction of his righteousness and, more importantly, unwavering faith in God, even though God's ways seemed mysterious and harsh to him in that moment of darkness. He did not yield to his friends' limited and accusatory view, maintaining his integrity and his ultimate trust in the Lord of the universe. But amidst the cries and accusations, a new voice arose. It was Elihu, a young spectator, who spoke with a different perspective than that of the older friends. He didn't see God merely as a punitive judge, but rather as a being who uses suffering as a tool, seeking restoration and transformation in human life. Elihu insisted that God communicates with us in many ways, and sometimes it is through pain that he calls us back to himself, seeking to purify and teach. Amidst all that discussion, Job still carried within his soul a deep longing, the incessant search to understand the reason for so much pain and loss. He cried out for an answer from the Most High himself, for an explanation for the inexplicable, for a glimpse of the divine justice behind his torment. And heaven heard. Suddenly, not with the answers Job expected, but with a powerful manifestation, the Lord answered from the midst of a whirlwind, a voice that shook the desert, an overwhelming presence that put all creation into perspective. God did not explain the why of Job's suffering, but posed questions that revealed his incomparable sovereignty and power. Where was Job when the earth was founded? When the morning stars sang together? When the sea burst forth from the womb? Who set limits for the waters? Who provided food for the lion? Who knows the path of light? Question after question, about creation, about the vastness of the universe, about God's absolute control over every detail of nature. Job's human wisdom, once so pondered and just, seemed like dust before the divine majesty revealed in those inquiries. Job realized his insignificance, his inability to comprehend the vast and unfathomable ways of the Creator. His heart was filled with an overwhelming sense of reverence and submission, recognizing that he knew nothing, could question nothing before God's infinite wisdom. The search for understanding gave way to worship, the perplexity to total surrender to the sovereign will of the Lord of hosts. It was humility before the unquestionable. After this transformative encounter with the Lord, after submission and understanding of divine majesty, an act of grace flowed from Job's heart. He prayed for those who had accused him, who judged his pain and suggested non-existent sins. Yes, for his friends, Job interceded before God, a prayer that sealed reconciliation and demonstrated the depth of his restored faith, a faith that held no grudges, but sought blessing for others, even those who erred. And then, the powerful hand of the Most High acted. The Lord heard Job's plea and changed his fortune in a glorious and complete way. The cruel illness that covered him with sores disappeared. Robust health was fully restored. And not only was physical health restored, But everything he had lost was also returned in a superabundant measure. His possessions, his vast wealth, were doubled. The Lord gave Job more than he owned before the trials, demonstrating his unlimited capacity to restore and bless. Job's house, previously empty of children's laughter and the presence of lost loved ones, was filled again. A new family was granted to him, sons and daughters who brought renewed joy and hope. A new generation was born under his blessing, a living testimony to God's faithfulness in the midst of devastation. The story of Job, with its profound sorrows and its glorious restoration, echoes through the centuries with an essential lesson. Even when life strikes us with inexplicable suffering, even when the darkness seems endless, faith and perseverance in God are our secure refuges. Unwavering trust in the character of the Lord, even when we do not understand his ways, is what sustains us. Job teaches us that faithfulness during adversity is not in vain, that God is capable of turning our sorrow into an even greater joy. And so Job, the man who endured the unendurable with faith, lived a long and extraordinarily blessed life. The sacred text records that he reached the age of 140 years, a vast period that allowed him to witness the growth of up to 4 generations of his descendants. He saw his grandchildren and great-grandchildren prosper. He lived, fully, enjoying God's blessings until the end of his days, departing at an advanced age, an eternal example of patience, faith, and the divine reward for those who trust in him unshakably. The lesson is clear: faithfulness to God, even in the deepest pain, is never in vain. The Lord honors those who honor him. And so, we reach the end of another journey through the sacred scriptures. If this message has touched your heart and enlightened your understanding, we ask that you leave your like, your comment, and, above all, that you subscribe to support our project of carrying the word forward. May the peace of the Lord be with you, and may God richly bless your life.